One player's shoes are sitting untouched in clearance bins. Another has quietly taken over the most powerful sports brand on earth. And somewhere inside Nike headquarters, a decision was made that's now sending shockwaves through women's basketball. Because this isn't just about sneakers anymore. Not long ago, the future seemed clear. A'ja Wilson was the safe bet. MVPs, championships, dominance on the court. Nike believed greatness would automatically translate into sales. On paper, it made perfect sense. But the market didn't care about paper. While Wilson's signature shoes struggled to move off shelves, something very different was happening behind closed doors. Caitlin Clark wasn't just getting marketing support, she was becoming the center of Nike's entire women's basketball vision. More access, more influence, more money, more patience, and reportedly more control than any WNBA player before her. That sudden shift raised uncomfortable questions. How did Nike go from betting on the league's most decorated star to building a future around its newest phenomenon? Why did one campaign quietly fade while another exploded before a signature shoe even launched? And was this really about performance, or something much bigger that brands rarely say out loud? Some say this was inevitable. Others claim Nike misread the room and paid the price. And depending on who you ask, this story is either about smart business or a massive warning sign for the league. Because once a brand like Nike chooses a direction, there's no turning back. And what happened next explains why everything changed. At first, it looked like a rumor, a few leaked clips, a couple of offhand comments, but once people started piecing it together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. What was happening inside Nike wasn't normal athlete treatment, it was a full-scale reorientation around one player. Employees began noticing subtle changes before the public ever caught on. Entire hallways were redesigned. Internal presentations stopped featuring a rotation of athletes and started centering on one face. Design meetings that usually involved committees suddenly revolved around a single voice. The message was quiet, but it was consistent. Priorities had shifted. This wasn't just marketing hype, this was infrastructure. Design teams were reassigned, budgets were reshuffled, projects that had been approved months earlier were paused or quietly sunset. Meanwhile, resources flowed freely in one direction. Engineers, creatives, and strategists were pulled into daily collaboration cycles that most athletes never even see. Instead of being handed finished products, this player was invited into the process itself. That detail matters. Because there's a massive difference between endorsing a shoe and helping build the blueprint for an entire product line. One is branding, the other is ownership-level influence. And inside Nike, that distinction sent shockwaves through teams who had never witnessed this level of access outside of all-time legends. What made it even more striking was the timing. This wasn't happening after years of proven retail dominance. The signature shoe hadn't even launched yet. There were no long-term sales numbers to point to, no historical data guaranteeing success. Nike wasn't reacting, they were anticipating. And that's where the tension started. As one campaign expanded, another quietly disappeared. Posters came down, promotions slowed, media buys dried up. Retail partners were told to adjust expectations. Officially, nothing dramatic was announced. Unofficially, everyone inside the building understood what was happening. Nike wasn't hedging anymore. They were committing. The company had decided that the future of women's basketball shoes wouldn't be built around past accolades, but around momentum, visibility, and cultural pull. And whether that bet pays off or backfires, one thing was already clear. There was no going back to the old plan. Because once a brand like Nike restructures from the inside out, it's not a phase, it's a statement. And the fallout from that statement was just beginning to show. For a while, Nike tried to keep two stories alive at the same time. On the surface, everything looked balanced. Multiple signature athletes, multiple campaigns, multiple lanes. But behind the scenes, the data was telling a much harsher truth, one the brand could no longer ignore. Retail feedback came first. Store managers started reporting slow movement on certain women's basketball releases. Inventory sat longer than expected. Price cuts happened earlier than planned. Then came the more uncomfortable metrics. Return rates, repeat purchases, and online engagement all lagged behind projections. The shoes weren't failing completely, but they weren't winning either. And in Nike's world, not winning is a problem. At the same time, something else was happening organically. Without a signature shoe on shelves, one player was dominating conversations anyway. Her PE colorways were showing up on pro courts. Fans were asking store employees about shoes that technically didn't exist yet. Social media clips drove comment sections filled with the same question: when do her shoes drop? That contrast was impossible to overlook. Nike's analysts ran side-by-side comparisons: campaign spend versus engagement, athlete visibility versus sell-through, hype versus hard revenue. The gap kept widening. One side required constant pushing just to stay relevant. The other pulled attention naturally without forcing it. This is where the internal tension escalated. Marketing teams hate admitting sunk costs. Nobody wants to say, "We bet wrong." But Nike doesn't survive by protecting feelings, it survives by cutting losses fast. Once leadership realized that excitement couldn't be manufactured, the strategy changed overnight. Budgets were quietly redirected. Media buys expired and weren't renewed. Retail partners were given new instructions about floor placement. Meanwhile, long-term planning decks started using different names, different timelines, different assumptions. What's critical here is that this wasn't about talent, it was about translation. Nike doesn't sell basketball skills, it sells stories, identity, and aspiration. And the data made one thing painfully clear: one athlete's story was resonating far beyond the court, while another's wasn't converting no matter how hard Nike tried to push it. From that point forward, the decision wasn't emotional, it was mathematical. And once the math settled the debate, everything else followed. Because in a business built on momentum, Nike wasn't willing to wait years for the market to maybe catch up. They wanted impact now. But what truly sealed the shift wasn't just sales or hype. It was what happened next inside the design labs. Once Nike redirected its attention, the change wasn't subtle, it was surgical. The design labs became the real battleground. Because that's where Nike decides who gets treated like a face of the future versus a short-term experiment. Normally, signature athletes rotate through Nike's innovation pipeline. They test samples, give feedback, then disappear until the next scheduled check-in. But this time, the routine broke completely. One player wasn't just testing shoes, she was embedded in the process. Day after day, meeting after meeting. Engineers weren't presenting finished ideas anymore. They were building concepts with her in the room. According to people familiar with the process, this level of access is almost unheard of. Even top NBA stars rarely get this much influence this early. But Nike saw something different here. They weren't just designing a shoe, they were reverse engineering a playing style that fans already found magnetic. Pressure sensors were recalibrated specifically for deep-range shooting. Traction patterns were adjusted based on abrupt lateral stops. Weight distribution was tested around balance points most players don't even stress. This wasn't cosmetic innovation, it was foundational. And that's where the gap became impossible to hide. Other signature projects struggled to evolve beyond aesthetics. Colorways changed, logos moved, but the core product stayed familiar. Nike's internal feedback loops flagged it. Testers didn't feel a leap. Retail buyers didn't feel urgency. The innovation just wasn't loud enough. In contrast, prototypes coming out of this new focus group felt different immediately. Engineers reportedly described them as category-defining, the kind of internal language Nike reserves for shoes that reset standards, not just join shelves. At that point, the company faced a fork in the road. They could spread resources evenly and hope the market responded over time, or they could concentrate everything on the one project, showing real breakthrough potential. Nike chose concentration. From there, decisions accelerated fast. Entire development teams were reassigned. Timelines were shortened for one athlete and quietly stretched for another. Even internal presentations shifted tone from testing viability to preparing scale. This wasn't favoritism, it was prioritization. Nike has always believed that innovation creates demand, not the other way around. And inside those labs, it became clear which athlete was pushing the brand forward and which one was simply along for the ride. Once that realization set in, the outcome was inevitable. Because when Nike commits to a technological leap, it doesn't hedge its bets. It goes all in. And that's when the tension finally spilled out of the labs and into the public eye, where reactions, resentment, and rumors began to collide. Nike didn't abandon anyone overnight. The real turning point didn't come from headlines, debates, or social media noise. It came from something far less emotional and far more ruthless: the market. Inside retail dashboards, the numbers started telling an uncomfortable story. Shoes that were supposed to anchor Nike's women's basketball push weren't moving. Launch week momentum faded fast. Restocks sat untouched. Discounts quietly rolled out earlier than planned, then deeper than expected. What was supposed to feel like scarcity started to look like excess. Retail partners noticed first. Floor managers reported low try-on rates. Buyers stopped requesting expanded colorways. Stores began reallocating premium shelf space to products that actually pulled foot traffic. Nike's internal sales forecasts had been optimistic, but reality didn't cooperate. At the same time, something strange was happening online. Without a signature shoe on shelves, one athlete was still dominating sneaker conversations. Her play-exclusive colorways showed up on highlight reels. Fans paused clips just to ask what was on her feet. Search trends climbed without a product to buy. That kind of organic demand is rare and impossible to manufacture. Nike tracks that obsessively. When analysts compared engagement metrics, the contrast was brutal. One campaign required constant paid support just to stay visible. The other generated attention effortlessly. No giveaways, no heavy ad spend, just curiosity pulling people in on its own. That's when internal confidence flipped. Executives began asking different questions, not how do we fix this rollout, but what happens if we scale the other one immediately? Development budgets shifted. Marketing timelines were redrawn. Retail partners were quietly prepped for a much larger release down the line. And then came the most telling sign. Nike stopped defending the struggling product publicly. No renewed push, no second-wave campaign, no influencer blitz. That silence wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Nike rarely fights the market. If demand doesn't respond, the brand moves forward, not backward. Meanwhile, planning sessions for the upcoming release started expanding. International demand projections were revised upward. Manufacturing capacity was adjusted early. Even resale platforms began preparing for supply shortages before Nike confirmed anything officially. That's when insiders realized this wasn't about favoritism or narrative control. It was about momentum. Nike had seen this pattern before: early Jordan, peak Kobe, even LeBron's early years. When consumers decide someone is next, resistance is pointless. You either ride the wave or get pulled under it. And Nike chose to ride. By the time fans noticed the shift, the decision had already been made months earlier. The brand wasn't betting on hype anymore. It was responding to proof. And once the market delivers proof, Nike doesn't hesitate, because the next move wasn't just a shoe launch. It was a full-scale reset of the women's basketball hierarchy. For years, Nike believed elite performance would naturally translate into elite sales. Win awards, dominate on the court, and the market would follow. That formula worked in earlier eras, but somewhere along the way, the rules changed, and this moment forced Nike to admit it. Inside the company, executives began dissecting what actually drives modern sneaker culture. not stats, not trophies, attention, connection, story, the ability to pull people in without asking. And when they compared those factors side by side, the gap became impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark didn't just perform, she sparked conversation. Her highlights traveled faster than official ads. Her clips crossed into spaces Nike couldn't buy access to. Fans didn't just watch her play, they argued about her, defended her, imitated her, and waited for whatever came next. That emotional investment is the holy grail of branding. By contrast, A'ja Wilson had a resume any athlete would envy. MVPs, championships, respect from peers, but respect doesn't always convert to demand. Nike's internal data showed that admiration didn't equal obsession, and obsession is what sells shoes. This is where the philosophy shifted. Nike wasn't choosing sides based on talent, they were choosing based on gravity. One player pulled culture toward her naturally, the other required explanation. And in 2026, explanation is death in marketing. Executives also looked closely at collaboration styles. One athlete challenged designs but stayed engaged, asked questions, thought long-term. The other reportedly resisted feedback and treated the process as transactional. That difference mattered more than fans realized. Nike doesn't just sell products, it builds ecosystems, and ecosystems only work when the centerpiece elevates everyone around them. Designers want to work on projects that feel alive. Engineers want feedback that improves the product. Marketers want stories that write themselves. Clark gave them that. That's why Nike was willing to overinvest. Because when a brand senses cultural inevitability, cost becomes secondary. You don't nickel and dime the future, you clear the runway. This wasn't about disrespecting past greatness. It was about understanding where attention is going, not where it's been. Nike had already learned this lesson the hard way before. Ignore momentum, and someone else will monetize it. So when the choice came down to protecting legacy or chasing impact, Nike didn't hesitate. They followed the pull. And once a brand like Nike commits to gravity, everything else, budgets, campaigns, even loyalties, realigns around it. But that decision didn't just elevate one athlete. It quietly exposed the cost of misunderstanding the modern audience, and the fallout from that realization was only beginning to surface. Nike didn't make this pivot quietly, and they knew the reaction would be loud. Internally, executives prepared for criticism long before the first Clark prototype ever leaked. Because whenever a brand elevates one star this aggressively, especially in women's basketball, the conversation stops being about sneakers and starts being about fairness, favoritism, and intent. And that's exactly what happened. As soon as word spread that Nike was reallocating budgets, rumors began circulating across league circles and social media. Some reports claimed Nike was abandoning balance in favor of hype. Others suggested the company was afraid to market multiple stars at once. None of it came with official confirmation, but the noise alone proved Nike's gamble was already working. People were paying attention again. What made this moment volatile wasn't just the money, it was the symbolism. A'ja Wilson represented earned excellence, years of dominance, a traditional rise built on results. For many fans, she embodied what athletes were supposed to be rewarded for. So when her campaign slowed down, it felt personal, even if the decision was purely commercial. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark symbolized momentum, virality, cultural crossover. She brought in viewers who didn't usually watch women's basketball, and that expansion mattered more to Nike than internal optics. Growth doesn't come from preaching to the choir, it comes from pulling new eyes into the room. Nike understood that choosing momentum over legacy would upset people, but they also understood something else. Controversy extends shelf life. Debate keeps products relevant longer than praise ever could. From an industry standpoint, sneaker analysts quietly admitted the shift made sense. Wilson's line struggled in retail environments. Clark's unreleased shoe was already driving online speculation, mock-ups, and resale predictions. One product needed marketing support to survive. The other created demand without existing. That difference is fatal in corporate decision-making. Nike didn't view this as choosing between two athletes. They viewed it as choosing between two timelines, one that was stable but stagnant, and another that was chaotic but explosive. Brands chasing the future rarely pick comfort. And they were willing to absorb the criticism because backlash fades, but attention compounds. By the time critics finished arguing about fairness, Nike had already moved on to execution. Design labs were locked in, rollout calendars finalized, influencer pipelines activated. Once that machine starts, it doesn't reverse. The harsh truth is this: Nike didn't miscalculate. They anticipated the outrage and priced it into the decision. Because in modern sports marketing, being controversial isn't a mistake. Being ignored is. And while the debate raged publicly, behind closed doors Nike was already focused on the only question that matters in the end: what happens when the shoe finally drops? At the highest level of sports marketing, talent is only the entry ticket. What separates a long-term brand cornerstone from a short-term endorsement is risk management. And this is where Nike's decision becomes easier to understand, even if it remains uncomfortable for some fans. Every signature athlete represents a bundle of variables Nike can't fully control: public perception, media reactions, interview soundbites, social media tone, locker room narratives. When a company commits tens of millions to a single face, they aren't just betting on performance, they're underwriting personality. This is where internal evaluations reportedly shifted. Caitlin Clark consistently tested as low-risk, high-reward. Her public persona stayed neutral but engaging. She avoided controversy without feeling manufactured. Sponsors saw her as adaptable, someone who could move between basketball diehards, casual fans, and global markets without friction. That flexibility matters when a shoe is meant to travel across cultures, platforms, and age groups. Clark's approach also signaled collaboration rather than confrontation. Brand partners value athletes who treat campaigns as shared projects, not personal battlegrounds. It reduces friction, speeds execution, and lowers the odds of costly reshoots, rewrites, or sudden pivots. For Nike, that translates directly into operational stability. On the other side, A'ja Wilson presented a more complicated profile. This isn't about skill or accolades, it's about predictability. Reports and fan discussions suggested moments of tension around messaging and expectations. Whether fair or not, perception becomes reality inside corporate boardrooms. Brands don't need chaos to be real, they just need it to be possible. Nike has been burned before by underestimating brand risk. When public narratives spiral, campaigns stall, retailers hesitate, international partners pull back. The cost of managing fallout often exceeds the cost of walking away early. From a purely business standpoint, minimizing volatility becomes a priority, even if it appears cold. That doesn't mean Nike judged character, it means they calculated exposure. Marketability today isn't about being the best, it's about being scalable. Can your image expand without fracturing? Can your message be remixed without backlash? Can your presence amplify others instead of competing with them? Clark checked those boxes. Wilson, fairly or unfairly, raised more questions than Nike wanted to answer long-term. And when brands face uncertainty at that scale, they rarely hedge, they consolidate. This is the uncomfortable reality of modern sports branding. Personality isn't just a trait, it's an asset class. And assets that introduce volatility get discounted, no matter how impressive their resume looks. Nike didn't walk away from greatness. They walked toward predictability. And in a market driven by attention, predictability paired with momentum is often the safest bet a global brand can make. At some point, Nike stopped experimenting and started committing. What began as cautious optimism around Caitlin Clark quietly turned into a full-scale brand pivot, and the reasons go far deeper than highlight reels or jersey sales. Nike's internal data reportedly told a clear story. Clark wasn't just popular, she was sticky. Fans didn't just watch her, they followed her, defended her, argued about her, and brought new eyes into the sport because of her. That kind of engagement is gold in modern marketing. It means your audience isn't passive. It's active, emotional, and invested. Nike doesn't chase moments anymore, it chases ecosystems. Clark created one almost overnight. Another factor was timing. Women's basketball is at an inflection point, and Nike knows these windows don't stay open forever. Miss the face of a movement, and you spend a decade playing catch-up. Clark arrived at the exact moment when casual fans were finally paying attention, when media narratives were ready, and when the culture wanted a central figure to rally around. Nike didn't just see an athlete, they saw a once-per-cycle opportunity. There's also the technical side that rarely gets discussed publicly. Clark's game translates exceptionally well to product storytelling. Her deep shooting range, quick footwork, and constant movement give designers tangible performance narratives to build around. That matters when selling footwear. It's easier to explain why a shoe exists when the athlete's playstyle visibly demands innovation. Nike could justify new cushioning systems, traction patterns, and lightweight builds because Clark's game requires them. Then there's global reach. Clark's appeal isn't confined to one demographic. She resonates with young girls, longtime basketball fans, casual sports viewers, and even audiences who don't traditionally follow the WNBA. That versatility lowers Nike's marketing friction internationally. A campaign that works in the US doesn't need to be rebuilt from scratch overseas. That alone can save tens of millions over the life of a signature line. Perhaps most importantly, Clark embraced the process. She didn't just endorse, she participated. Brands notice that. Athletes who show up, listen, and collaborate become partners rather than liabilities. Over time, that trust compounds. Nike didn't just feel confident launching her shoe, they felt confident building a future around her. So when Nike went all in, it wasn't a gamble. It was a calculated consolidation of momentum, timing, personality, and market data. They didn't choose Clark because she was loud. They chose her because everything around her was accelerating, and Nike knew exactly when to step on the gas. Strip away the headlines, and this story isn't really about shoes. It's about how power shifts in modern sports without anyone announcing it. Nike didn't issue a press release saying they were changing direction. They didn't publicly downgrade anyone. They simply redirected attention, resources, and belief, and let the results speak. This is how brands operate now. Loud declarations invite backlash. Quiet reallocations avoid it. One athlete gets more access, more visibility, more patience. Another slowly fades from the center without a formal goodbye. Fans notice eventually, but by then, the decision is already irreversible. The uncomfortable truth is that dominance today isn't just earned on the court. It's earned in meeting rooms, marketing decks, and long-term projections. Momentum compounds faster than trophies. Narrative outpaces resume. And once a company like Nike decides who represents the future, everything else becomes secondary. What happens next will define more than a signature shoe. It will shape how future women's basketball stars are evaluated, not just by performance, but by adaptability, presence, and brand gravity. Because in the modern era, the biggest victories don't always happen during games. Sometimes they happen quietly, long before the crowd realizes the scoreboard has already changed.